The door stood open in the morning light, swinging gently on its hinge. Inside, the blacksmith's cottage was silent. The fire had died in the forge, and the air held the faint metallic scent of old iron and something else, something darker. Neighbours had passed the blacksmith family's door a dozen times that week, noting the stillness, the absence of smoke from the chimney, the strange quiet where once the ring of hammer on anvil had marked the hours. When they finally stepped across the threshold on that cold March morning in 1870, they found not absence but presence. The blacksmith family had not departed. They lay where they had fallen days before in the small rooms of their cottage in Denham, Buckinghamshire. The father, the mother, the children, all still. The discovery sent a shudder through the village that would not fade for generations. This was no accident, no sudden illness. The marks upon them told a different story. Someone had entered that cottage with purpose, with violence, with a darkness that had no name in the quiet countryside. The bodies had lain there in the cold undiscovered, while the village went about its ordinary days. And now, as the constables arrived and the whispers began, the true horror of what had happened in that blacksmith's home would slowly, terribly come to light. Chapter 1. The Forge Falls Silent. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world outside has grown distant and small. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour finds you in this moment, know that you are safe here. The stories we tell are old ones, events long settled into the dust of time, and though they carry darkness, they cannot reach you now. Perhaps you are listening in the late evening, or in those small hours before dawn when sleep proves elusive. Perhaps you are far from England, or perhaps you are close to the very ground where these events unfolded. Wherever you find yourself, I am grateful you have chosen to spend this time here, in the company of history's quieter voices. Before we begin, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so. Your support helps these stories continue, helps us preserve and share the forgotten corners of the past. And if this tale moves you in any way, consider sharing it with others who seek knowledge in the stillness of night. These stories matter. They remind us of who we were, and perhaps who we might yet become. Now, let us drift backward in time to the year 1870, to a village called Denham in the county of Buckinghamshire, where a blacksmith's cottage stood at the edge of a common, and where, for a few terrible days in March, silence fell where once there had been the steady rhythm of labour and life. Denham was not a large place. It sat nestled in the gentle countryside west of London, a village of perhaps 300 souls, connected to the capital by the Grand Junction Canal and the Great Western Railway, yet still possessed of that rural character that made it seem separate from the rushing progress of the age. The land rolled gently there, marked by hedgerows and commons, by small farms and cottages that had stood for generations. The parish church of St. Mary the Virgin rose above the village green, its tower visible from the surrounding fields, a landmark and a comfort to those who worked the land. Life in Denham followed patterns worn smooth by repetition. Farmers tended their fields according to the seasons. Labourers worked the canal barges that passed through on their way to and from the city. Women kept house and raised children, baked bread, tended gardens, carried water from the wells and pumps. The wealthy families, the bowyers and the palmers, maintained their estates at the edges of the village, employing servants and groundskeepers, hosting occasional gatherings that gave the working folk something to observe and discuss. The public houses, the Swan and the Green Man, surtout, served as gathering places where men could drink ale and share news after the day's labour ended. It was a community bound by proximity and necessity, where everyone knew everyone else, at least by sight, and where privacy was a luxury few could afford. Among the residents of Denham was a man named Emmanuel Marshall, a blacksmith by trade, who lived with his family in a cottage that stood near Denham Green. The cottage was modest, constructed of brick and timber in the manner common to such dwellings, with a thatched roof and small windows that admitted little light even on bright days. Attached to the cottage was Marshall's forge, where he worked iron into the shapes required by his neighbours and clients: horseshoes, tools, hinges, towels, gates, repairs to farm equipment, These were the bread and butter of a village blacksmith's trade. The work was hot and heavy, requiring strength and skill, and Marshall had practiced it for years, his hands calloused and scarred from the forge's demands. The sound of his hammer striking heated metal on the anvil was a familiar rhythm in that part of Denham, a reassuring sign that someone was at work, that the ordinary business of life continued. Marshall lived there with his wife, Mary Ann, and their children. The family structure was typical of the time, with the father serving as the primary breadwinner and the mother managing the domestic sphere. The children, whose exact number and ages were recorded in parish registers and census documents, represented both the family's future and their vulnerability. Children in that era faced constant threats from disease, accident, and the general harshness of 19th century life. Infant mortality remained high, and even those who survived their first years could be carried off by scarlet fever, diphtheria, or any number of ailments that modern medicine would later conquer. Yet the Marshall children had survived thus far, growing up in the shadow of their father's forge, learning the routines of village life, attending Sunday services at St. Mary's, playing in the fields and lanes around their home when their chores allowed. The Marshalls were not wealthy. Few in Denham were, apart from the landowners, but neither were they destitute. Marshall's trade provided enough to keep his family fed and housed, to pay the rent on the cottage and forge, to purchase the coal and iron stock necessary for his work. They were, in the Victorian parlance, respectable working folk, neither rising into the middle class nor sinking into the desperate poverty that characterised the worst slums of London and the industrial cities. They attended church. They paid their debts. They kept to themselves, for the most part, engaging with neighbours as necessity and courtesy required, but maintaining that boundary between public and private life that English culture so valued. In the first weeks of March 1870, the rhythms of life in Denham continued as they always had. The weather was cold, as March often was, with frost still touching the fields in the mornings and the sun providing little warmth even at midday. The canal flowed steadily, its waters dark and slow. The railway carried passengers and goods between London and the west. Farmers began preparing for spring planting, checking fences, clearing drainage ditches, making ready for the season ahead. In the village proper, shopkeepers opened their doors each morning. The baker fired his ovens, the publican tapped fresh barrels, the butcher hung his cuts of meat in the window. Children walked to the village school when their families could spare them from labour. Women gathered at the pump to draw water and exchange gossip. Men greeted each other in the street with nods and brief words, discussing weather and work and the small dramas that constituted village life. At the Marshall cottage, however, something had changed. The forge, which typically began its work early in the morning, remained cold. No smoke rose from the chimney. The familiar clang of hammer on anvil did not sound. The door, usually open during working hours to allow ventilation and access for customers, stayed closed. For a day, perhaps two, this attracted little notice. A blacksmith might take a day off for illness, or to attend to business elsewhere, or simply because the work allowed it. But as the days accumulated, as the silence persisted, the absence began to seem strange. Neighbours who had reason to pass by the cottage noted the stillness. Those who had work that needed doing, a horse that needed shoeing or a tool that required repair, found themselves turning away from the closed door, puzzled but not yet alarmed. In a village like Denham, privacy and reticence were respected. One did not intrude without cause. The English character of the period valued restraint, the ability to mind one's own affairs and allow others to mind theirs. To knock uninvited on a neighbour's door, to peer through windows, to ask prying questions, these were seen as violations of proper conduct. And so even as the days passed and the Marshall cottage remained silent, even as the forge stayed cold and no one saw the family come or go, the neighbours held back. They wondered, certainly. They spoke to each other in low tones, speculating about illness or trouble or some family matter that required privacy. But they did not act, not yet. The weather during those days remained cold and grey, the kind of English March weather that seems to press down upon the land, draining colour from the landscape and spirit from the people. The sky hung low and heavy, threatening rain that came in fits and spurts, never enough to truly cleanse but sufficient to turn the roads muddy and make outdoor work miserable. In such weather, Beausins, it was natural for people to stay indoors as much as possible, to huddle near their fires and venture out only when necessary. This too contributed to the delay in discovery. In warmer, brighter weather, people would have been about more, would have noticed more quickly the prolonged absence of a family from the daily routines of village life. But in the cold grey days of early March, everyone retreated into their own small worlds, concerned with keeping warm and dry, with getting through the work that had to be done, with simply enduring until spring truly arrived. Yet the silence from the Marshall cottage grew heavier with each passing day. The neighbours closest to the property began to feel a vague unease, a sense that something was not right. Women who passed by on their way to the pump or the shop found their eyes drawn to the closed door, the empty forge. Men who had business that would normally have taken them to Marshall's workshop made do without, or travelled to another smithy in a neighbouring village, but they wondered. The absence of children too was notable. In a village where everyone knew everyone, where children were a constant presence in the streets and fields, the failure of the Marshall children to appear for days on end should have been a clear signal. But children fell ill, families kept them home for any number of reasons, and so the unease remained unease, not yet crystallising into true alarm. The village continued its rhythms around the silent cottage. Services were held at St Mary's, the congregation gathering on Sunday to sing hymns and hear the vicar's sermon, to pray for the living and remember the dead. The Marshall family was not present, but attendance at church, while expected, was not universal. People had reasons for absence that were considered valid, or at least not worth investigating. The publican at the Swan continued to serve his customers, the conversations flowing as they always did, touching on politics and weather and local concerns. The Great Western Railway brought newspapers from London, carrying news of the wider world, parliamentary debates, foreign wars, industrial accidents, crimes and scandals that seemed very distant from the quiet countryside of Buckinghamshire. In the city, life moved at a frantic pace, but here in Denham, time seemed to move more slowly, measured in seasons and harvests rather than hours and minutes. It was perhaps 5 days, perhaps 6, the exact timeline would later be debated, before the unease finally became action. A neighbour, whose name would appear in subsequent records and testimony, decided that the silence had gone on too long. Perhaps it was concern for the family's welfare. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Perhaps it was that peculiarly English sense of duty. The feeling that something ought to be done, even if one preferred not to be the one to do it. Whatever the motivation, this neighbour approached the Marshall cottage on a morning in mid-March, walked up to the door and knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, calling out Marshall's name, still nothing. He tried the door and found it not locked, but simply closed, as though the family had stepped out and would return momentarily. But they had not stepped out. They would not return. And when that door swung open on its hinge, admitting the pale morning light into the cottage's dim interior, what lay within would shatter the quiet of Denham forever. The neighbour stood in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and what he saw there froze him in place. He did not enter. He did not need to. Even from the threshold the truth was evident. Something terrible had happened in that cottage. Something that would require constables and coroners, that would bring officials from London, that would see the story of the Marshall family printed in newspapers across England. The forge had fallen out not because of illness or absence, but because death had entered that home, had walked through these very rooms, and had left behind a scene of horror that would haunt Denham for generations to come. Chapter 2. The Discovery. The neighbour who opened that door would carry the memory of what he saw for the remainder of his life. In the dim light that filtered through the cottage's small windows, the interior appeared at first simply untidy, as though the family had left in haste and not yet returned. But as his eyes adjusted, as the shapes within resolved themselves from shadow into substance, the true nature of the scene revealed itself with terrible clarity. Bodies lay within those rooms, not sleeping, not resting, but unmistakably dead, and had been dead for some time. The neighbour stumbled backward from the threshold, his mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes had witnessed. He did not enter further. Whatever horrors lay within that cottage would have to wait for those with official authority to investigate. His immediate task was simpler and more urgent. He needed to summon help, to alert the village, to set in motion the machinery of law and inquiry that such a discovery demanded. He ran through the streets of Denham calling for assistance, his shouts drawing people from their homes and shops. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered near the Marshall cottage, though none dared approach too closely. The English reserve that had kept neighbours from investigating earlier now manifested as a collective reluctance to confront the horror directly. People stood at a distance, speaking in hushed tones, speculating in whispers about what might have occurred. Some suggested illness, perhaps cholera or typhus, though the diseases that killed swiftly rarely left entire families dead in their homes without someone raising an alarm first. Others whispered darker possibilities, words like murder passing from lip to lip with a mixture of horror and fascination. In a village where life proceeded according to predictable patterns, where violence of any kind was rare, the possibility that someone had deliberately killed the Marshall family seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet what else could explain the silence, the closed doors, the bodies lying undiscovered for days? Someone was dispatched to fetch the village constable, a local man appointed to maintain order and investigate minor crimes, though his experience with serious matters was limited. Denham, like most rural villages, rarely saw anything more dramatic than petty theft, drunken brawls, or poaching disputes. The constable arrived within the hour, pushing through the gathered crowd with the authority his position granted him. He was accompanied by the local doctor, a man whose services were called upon for births and deaths, for setting broken bones and treating fevers, but who had never before been asked to examine bodies in circumstances like these. Together the constable and the doctor approached the cottage door, steeling themselves for what lay within. The crowd watched in silence, waiting for confirmation of what the first witness had reported. The constable entered first, the doctor following close behind. They moved slowly through the small rooms of the cottage, their eyes taking in details that would later be recorded in official reports and inquest testimony. The interior of the dwelling was modest, as befitted a blacksmith's family. The main room served as kitchen and living space, with a hearth for cooking and warmth, a rough wooden table, a few chairs, shelves holding dishes and cooking implements. A door led to a smaller room used for sleeping. The walls were bare brick in places, whitewashed plaster in others. The floor was packed earth in the older sections, wooden planks in the newer. Light entered through windows that were small and set high, designed more for ventilation than illumination. The air inside was cold, nearly as cold as the air outside, for the fire had long since died and no one had lived to rekindle it. In the main room they found the first body. Emmanuel Marshall, the blacksmith, lay near the hearth. He was a large man, made powerful by years of working iron, his arms thick with muscle, his hands scarred and calloused, but strength had not saved him from whatever had befallen his family. He lay on his back, his eyes closed, his face bearing an expression that might have been surprise or might simply have been the relaxation that comes with death. His clothing was the rough garb of a workingman, shirt and trousers, stained with the soot and grime of the forge. There was blood on his clothing, though not a great quantity. The doctor knelt beside him, examining the body with professional detachment despite the circumstances. He noted wounds on the head, injuries that appeared to have been inflicted with a heavy object, perhaps a hammer or iron bar, tools that would have been readily available in any blacksmith's workshop. In the smaller room they found Mary Ann Marshall. She lay upon the bed, her body arranged as though she had been sleeping when death came. She wore a nightdress, simple and worn, the kind of garment that women of her station would have made themselves from inexpensive cloth. Her face was pale, drained of colour by days of death, her hair loose and spread upon the pillow. The doctor examined her carefully, finding similar wounds to those her husband had sustained, blows to the head, delivered with force sufficient to cause death, though whether the first blow had killed her, or whether she had suffered multiple strikes before succumbing, he could not immediately determine. There were no signs of struggle visible in the room. The bedclothes were not disarranged. No furniture was overturned. Whatever had happened here had happened quickly, or had happened to someone who could not or did not resist. The children were found in another small room, a space barely large enough to contain the simple bed they shared. There were 3 of them, though accounts would later vary slightly in recording their exact ages. The eldest was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, the youngest still an infant of less than 2 years. They lay together, the older children positioned as though they had been trying to protect the youngest when death came for them. The doctor examined each small body with a heaviness of spirit that his professional training could not entirely suppress. Children were meant to be examined for common ailments, for fevers and coughs and childhood diseases. They were not meant to be examined as victims of violence, their young lives cut short by deliberate cruelty. Yet that was unmistakably what had occurred here. Each child bore wounds similar to those inflicted upon the parents. Blows to the head, delivered with sufficient force to kill. The constable and doctor moved through the cottage methodically, noting details that might prove significant in determining what had happened. The door showed no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact, the wood around the frame undamaged. Either the door had been unlocked when the killer entered, or the killer had been admitted by someone within. The windows were similarly undisturbed, their shutters closed from the inside, their glass intact. There were no signs of robbery. Marshall's tools remained in the forge area, valuable items of iron and steel that any thief would have taken. A small amount of money was found in a tin box, untouched. Whatever had motivated this slaughter, it had not been simple theft. The killer had come with a different purpose, had done what he came to do, and had departed without taking anything of material value. The bodies themselves told a story, though interpreting that story required careful examination and considerable caution in drawing conclusions. The doctor noted that all the wounds appeared to have been inflicted with the same type of weapon, likely something heavy and blunt, wielded with considerable force. The pattern of injuries suggested that the killer had struck multiple times, ensuring death rather than risking that his victims might survive and identify him. There was relatively little blood visible, which suggested that most of the bleeding had been internal, or that death had come quickly enough that the heart had stopped pumping before significant external bleeding could occur. The bodies showed signs of decomposition consistent with having lain dead for several days, though estimating the exact time of death with precision was difficult in the cold conditions that had prevailed. The condition of the cottage suggested that the family had been going about their normal evening routines when death arrived. There were dishes on the table, though whatever food they had contained had long since gone cold and begun to spoil. A kettle sat near the hearth, its contents evaporated to nothing. Clothing hung on pegs near the door. The children's few toys and possessions were scattered about as children's things always were. Everything spoke of ordinary life interrupted, of a family that had expected to continue living, to wake the next morning and face another day of work and routine. They had not known that an ending was coming, had not prepared for departure, had not said farewells. Death had simply arrived, sudden and brutal, and had left them where they fell. The constable knew that this matter exceeded his authority and expertise. This was not a case of drunken violence that could be settled with a night in the local lockup and a fine imposed by the magistrate. This was murder, multiple murders, the killing of an entire family including small children. This would require investigators from London, detectives from Scotland Yard if necessary, men trained in the modern methods of criminal investigation that were still relatively new in the 1870s. He would need to preserve the scene as it was, preventing contamination or disturbance of evidence that might prove crucial. He would need to take statements from anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual in the days before the discovery. He would need to compile a list of everyone who had known the family, everyone who might have had reason to wish them harm. The work ahead was daunting, and he felt the weight of responsibility settling upon his shoulders. Outside the cottage, the crowd had grown larger as word spread through Denham and the surrounding area. People came from the neighbouring farms and villages drawn by the terrible news, wanting to see the place where such horror had occurred, even if they could not see the horror itself. The constable emerged from the cottage and addressed the gathered villagers, confirming what most had already guessed. The Marshall family was dead, all of them, killed by a person or persons unknown. The bodies would need to be removed to a suitable location where the doctor could conduct a more thorough examination. The cottage would need to be secured and guarded until proper investigators could arrive. Anyone with that information, anyone who had seen or heard anything unusual in recent days, should come forward immediately. The crowd received this news in stunned silence. Murder was something that happened in London, in the great cities where vice and poverty created conditions for violence. It was not something that happened in Denham, in quiet Buckinghamshire, in a village where everyone knew everyone, and life proceeded according to ancient peaceful rhythms. Yet it had happened. The bodies in the cottage were proof of that, and now the village would have to grapple with the reality that evil had walked among them, had entered a home and destroyed a family, and had perhaps walked away again unrecognised, its face unknown, its motive a mystery. The forge had fallen silent, and in that silence questions multiplied. Who had done this? Why had they done it? Were they still in Denham, perhaps even standing among the crowd gathered outside the cottage? Or had they fled, disappearing into the vast anonymity of London or the countryside beyond? The answers would not come easily, and the search for them would transform this quiet village into something it had never been before. A place haunted not by ghosts but by the terrible knowledge that safety was an illusion, and that darkness could descend without warning. Chapter 3. The Victims. The task of removing the bodies from the cottage fell to men who had known the Marshall family in life, who had greeted them in the street and done business at the forge, and who now had to carry them to the temporary mortuary that had been established in a building near the church. It was grim work, made more difficult by the condition of the bodies and by the emotional weight of handling neighbours who had died in such circumstances. The men who performed this duty did so in silence, their faces set in expressions of determination and sorrow. They wrapped each body in clean cloth, lifting them with as much dignity as the situation allowed, carrying them through streets now lined with onlookers who removed their hats and bowed their heads as the small procession passed. In death, the Marshalls were receiving a respect and attention that they had never commanded in life, transformed from ordinary working folk into tragic figures whose story would be told and retold for years to come. Emmanuel Marshall, the father, had been 42 years old at the time of his death. He had lived his entire life in the vicinity of Denham, born in the village or near enough to it that he had never known any other home. His trade as a blacksmith had been learned through apprenticeship, the traditional method by which such skills were passed from one generation to the next. A man would take a boy of 12 or 13, teach him the craft over a period of 7 years, providing room and board in exchange for labour, and at the end of that period, the boy would emerge as a journeyman, qualified to work independently or to set up his own shop if he could afford the tools and premises. Marshall had completed such an apprenticeship decades earlier, and had established himself in Denham as a competent if unremarkable practitioner of his trade. He was not wealthy, would never be wealthy, for a village blacksmith's income depended on the needs of farmers and labourers who themselves possessed little surplus money. But he earned enough to support his family, to keep them housed and fed, to maintain his position in the respectable working class. Those who had known Marshall described him in terms that suggested a man of steady, quiet character. He was not given to drinking to excess, though he might take a pint at the Swan when the week's work was done. He was not known for violent temper, though the physical demands of his trade required strength and a certain toughness that manifested in his bearing. He attended church services with his family, though whether from genuine piety or simply from recognition that such attendance was expected of respectable people, no one could say with certainty. He paid his debts and fulfilled his contracts, completing the work he was hired to do without complaint or delay. He was, in the assessment of his neighbours, an ordinary man leading an ordinary life distinguished by no particular virtue or vice, simply doing his best to provide for his family in a world that offered little security to people of his station. Mary Ann Marshall, born Mary Ann Tilbury, had been 38 years old. She had grown up in a village not far from Denham, the daughter of agricultural labourers, and had married Emmanuel when she was in her early 20s. The marriage was typical of the time and class, arranged not through romantic courtship of the sort celebrated in novels, but through the practical considerations that governed working-class life. A blacksmith needed a wife to manage his household, to cook and clean and raise children, to contribute her labour to the family economy. A young woman needed a husband to provide shelter and support, to give her a recognised place in the community, to father the children that were expected and necessary. Whether love grew between them over the years of their marriage, no one could say. Such matters were considered private, and the working class did not speak openly of the emotions that might be expressed through glances and small gestures rather than words. Mary Ann had fulfilled the duties expected of her. She had borne children, though like many women of her time, she had also buried children, for infant mortality claimed 1 in 4 or even 1 in 3 babies before they reached their first year. She had managed the household on the limited income her husband's trade provided, stretching pennies, making do, repairing clothing rather than buying new, growing vegetables in the small garden plot behind the cottage, keeping chickens for eggs, performing the endless labour that kept a working-class family functioning. She had been seen in the village regularly, at the pump drawing water, at the baker's shop purchasing bread, at the church on Sundays with her children scrubbed and dressed as well as their circumstances allowed. Neighbours described her as quiet, respectable, devoted to her children. She had no enemies that anyone knew of, no conflicts that would explain why someone would wish her dead. The children whose lives ended in that cottage represented the Marshall family's future, the continuation of their line, the hope that all parents carried that their children might have better lives than they themselves had known. The eldest child, a boy, had been 11 years old. He had begun to assist his father in the forge, learning the rudiments of the blacksmith's trade, hauling coal, and pumping the bellows, watching and learning as his father shaped hot iron. In a few more years he would have been apprenticed formally, beginning the 7-year journey toward becoming a blacksmith himself. He had attended the village school when his father could spare him from work, learning to read and write and cipher, basic skills that were increasingly seen as necessary even for the labouring classes. Teachers who had instructed him remembered a boy of average abilities, neither particularly bright nor particularly slow, simply another child from a working family trying to acquire enough education to function in an increasingly complex world. The second child, a girl, had been 8 years old. She had helped her mother with household tasks, learning the skills that would be expected of her as a woman, how to clean and cook and mend, how to manage the domestic sphere that would be her domain if she married and established her own household. She had also attended the village school, though her education would have been considered less important than her brother's. For girls of her class were expected to become wives and mothers, roles that required practical skills rather than extensive literacy. Still, she had learned to read simple texts and to write her name, accomplishments that would have pleased her parents. Neighbours who remembered her spoke of a quiet, obedient child who played in the lanes with other village children, who carried water for her mother, who attended Sunday school where she learned Bible verses and moral lessons. The youngest child, a boy, had been not quite 2 years old. He had barely begun to walk and talk, had barely begun to develop a personality that others could describe. He was simply a baby, utterly dependent on his mother for survival, too young to understand anything of the world beyond his immediate needs for food and warmth and comfort. His death perhaps was the most troubling of all, for an 11-year-old boy might conceivably have been seen as a potential witness who needed to be silenced. And an 8-year-old girl might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but what threat could an infant pose? His death suggested either a killer so thorough that he left no one alive who might raise an alarm, or a killer so devoid of human feeling that even a helpless baby could not move him to mercy. The doctor who examined the bodies in the temporary mortuary was a man named Strickland, a physician who had practiced in Denham and the surrounding area for more than a decade. He had seen death in many forms, from the lingering decline of consumption to the sudden cessation of heart failure, from the fevers that took children to the accidents that claimed labourers in fields and workshops, but he had never before examined bodies that bore such clear evidence of deliberate violence. He worked methodically, noting the location and nature of each wound, measuring and documenting with the care that would be required if his findings were to be presented as evidence in a criminal trial. The law would demand precision, would require that he testify under oath about what he had observed, and he knew that his testimony might mean the difference between a murderer escaping justice or hanging from the gallows. Each victim had sustained multiple blows to the head. The weapon used had been heavy and blunt, capable of fracturing the skull with a single strike, but applied multiple times to ensure death. The pattern of injuries suggested that the victims had been attacked while in their beds or while sitting, not while standing and able to defend themselves. There were no defensive wounds visible on the hands or arms, no evidence that any of the victims had raised their hands to ward off blows or had fought with their attacker. This suggested either that they had been taken completely by surprise, struck down before they could react, or that they had been attacked while sleeping and had never fully awakened. The lack of blood spatter on the walls or furnishings suggested that the blows had not opened major blood vessels immediately, that most of the bleeding had been internal, or had occurred after the victim was already on the ground. The doctor could estimate, though not with complete certainty, that death had occurred approximately 5 to 7 days before the bodies were discovered. The cold weather had slowed decomposition, making precise timing difficult. But certain signs, the degree of rigor mortis that had come and gone, the beginning stages of tissue breakdown, the smell that had begun to permeate the cottage, all pointed to a timeline that matched the period during which neighbours had noted the family's absence. This meant that the Marshall family had likely been killed sometime in the first week of March, during those cold grey days when everyone stayed indoors as much as possible, when the village was quiet and neighbours were not out and about observing each other's comings and goings. The killer had chosen his moment well, or had been fortunate in his timing. The weather and the English habit of respecting privacy had given him several days' head start before anyone even knew a crime had been committed. As word of the murders spread beyond Denham, as newspapers in London and other cities picked up the story, the Marshall family began to be transformed from real people into symbols. They became victims of Victorian England's dark underbelly, evidence that the forces of disorder and violence that supposedly characterized the urban slums could penetrate even into the quiet countryside. They became subjects of moral lessons about the precariousness of life and the need for vigilance against evil. They became topics of conversation in parlours and public houses, their deaths discussed by people who had never known them, who speculated freely about what might have motivated such a crime, who assigned meanings and motives that may or may not have had any connection to reality. But beneath all the speculation and symbolism, beneath the newspaper accounts and the public discussions, there remained the simple fact of 5 lives ended, 5 people who had done nothing to deserve their fate, who had simply been in their home one evening when someone entered with murder in his heart. The vicar of St. Mary's Church, a man who had baptised the Marshall children and who had seen the family in his congregation Sunday after Sunday, now faced the task of preparing funeral services for all 5 victims. It was an unprecedented situation. The parish had buried its share of the dead over the centuries, from the plague victims of the Middle Ages to the agricultural labourers killed in farm accidents. From the children carried off by disease to the elderly who simply reached the end of their allotted years. But never before had he been asked to conduct services for an entire family murdered in their home. He struggled with the theology of it, with how to make sense of such senseless violence, with what words of comfort he could offer to a community that felt violated and afraid. In the end, he would speak of mystery, of the limits of human understanding, of faith that persisted even when reason faltered. But those were words for the future. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, he could only pray for the dead and for those left behind to mourn them. Chapter 4. The constables arrive. The murder of the Marshall family exceeded the investigative capacity of Denham's village constable, and within hours of the discovery, messages had been dispatched to the authorities in London requesting assistance. The machinery of Victorian law enforcement, still developing its modern form in the 1870s, began to turn. The Metropolitan Police, established by Robert Peel some 4 decades earlier, had developed specialised detective divisions capable of handling serious crimes, though the coordination between London's police and rural constabularies remained imperfect. Buckinghamshire maintained its own policing structures, overseen by magistrates and supervised by the county authorities, but for a crime of this magnitude, collaboration with Scotland Yard's experienced investigators was deemed necessary. The age of professional criminal investigation was still young, and methods that would later become standard practice were only beginning to be developed and refined. The first detective to arrive in Denham came not from London, but from Uxbridge, the nearest town of significant size. His name was Inspector William Tanner, a man of middle years who had served in various capacities in the Buckinghamshire Constabulary for more than 2 decades. He had investigated thefts and assaults, had dealt with poaching disputes and public drunkenness, had even overseen inquests into suspicious deaths on occasion. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the scene that awaited him in the Marshall cottage. He arrived on the afternoon of the day the bodies were discovered, travelling by rail to Denham station and then proceeding on foot to the cottage, where the village constable had maintained guard to prevent unauthorised entry. The crowd of onlookers had not dispersed but had grown, people standing in small groups speaking in low voices, their eyes fixed on the cottage as though expecting some revelation to emerge from its silent walls. Inspector Tanner entered the cottage alone, wanting to form his own impressions before consulting with others. The interior was dim and cold, the air heavy with the smell of death, despite the bodies having been removed hours earlier. He moved slowly from room to room, his eyes taking in details, his mind working to construct a narrative of what had happened here. The main room showed signs of ordinary domestic life interrupted. A kettle near the cold hearth, dishes on the table, clothing on pegs. The sleeping rooms were similarly undisturbed, apart from the bloodstains that marked where bodies had lain. He examined the door carefully, running his fingers over the wood, checking the lock and hinges. No signs of forced entry. Either the door had been unlocked, or the killer had possessed a key, or had been admitted by someone within. He examined the windows with equal care, finding them all secured from the inside, the shutters closed, the glass intact. The forge area attached to the cottage contained the tools of Marshall's trade. Hammers of various sizes, tongs for handling hot metal, files and chisels, an anvil showing the wear of years of use, a coal-fired forge now cold and filled with grey ash. Tanner examined the hammers with particular attention, for any of them could have served as the murder weapon. He looked for traces of blood, for signs that one had been cleaned recently, for anything that might identify which tool had been used to strike the fatal blows. But the tools were all stained with soot and grime from years of use, and in the dim light it was impossible to distinguish old stains from new. He made notes in a small book he carried, documenting what he observed, forming the beginnings of an investigation that would need to be systematic and thorough if it was to have any hope of success. Outside, he interviewed the village constable, learning the timeline of events as the local man understood them. The family had last been seen alive, definitively seen by multiple witnesses, on the evening of March the 7th. Various neighbours had noticed the closed forge and silent cottage over the following days, but had not investigated until March 13th, when concern finally overcame reticence. This gave a window of 6 days during which the murders could have occurred. The cold weather meant that establishing a more precise time of death would be difficult, but the doctor's examination suggested death had come early in that window, probably on March 7th or 8th. Tanner made notes, his experienced mind already considering possibilities. A crime committed in the evening or night, when the family would have been home and possibly preparing for bed. A time when neighbours would have been indoors themselves, unlikely to observe someone approaching or leaving the Marshall cottage. The inspector then spoke with the doctor, reviewing the medical findings in detail. The wounds to each victim, the likely weapon, the lack of defensive injuries, the minimal blood evidence. Strickland described his observations in the careful language of professional medicine, avoiding speculation but providing facts that Tanner could use to construct his theories. The nature of the wound suggested strength and determination. The killer had struck hard and struck multiple times. This was not a crime of passion that had gotten out of hand, with a single blow struck in anger, and the perpetrator immediately fleeing in horror at what he had done. This was methodical murder, each victim dispatched efficiently, the killer moving through the cottage with purpose, ensuring that no one survived to identify him. Tanner began the process of taking statements from Denham's residents, starting with those who lived nearest the Marshall cottage. Had anyone seen or heard anything unusual on the evening of March 7th, or in the days following? Had anyone observed strangers in the village, unfamiliar faces that might indicate someone from outside the community had come with criminal intent? Had anyone noticed tensions or conflicts involving the Marshall family that might suggest a motive? The responses were frustratingly vague. People had been indoors during the cold evenings. No one recalled hearing screams or sounds of struggle, though the cottage walls were thick and such sounds might not have carried far. No one reported seeing strangers, though people passed through Denham regularly on the canal, Elmsvornel and railway, and a stranger moving with purpose might not have attracted particular notice. No one knew of conflicts or enemies that would explain such violence. As Tanner conducted his interviews, a second investigator arrived from London, Detective Sergeant Charles Witcher of Scotland Yard, a man whose name would become associated with some of the most famous criminal cases of the Victorian era, though his career would also be marked by controversy and failure. Witcher brought with him the methods that were beginning to define modern detective work: careful examination of physical evidence, systematic interviewing of witnesses, attention to motive and opportunity, the patient accumulation of facts that might eventually point toward a suspect. He consulted with Tanner, reviewing what had been learned so far, and the two men divided responsibilities. Tanner would continue interviewing residents and investigating the Marshall family's background and relationships. Witcher would focus on the physical evidence and the crime scene, looking for clues that might have been overlooked in the initial shock of discovery. Witcher returned to the cottage for a more detailed examination. He brought with him a magnifying lens, a relatively new tool in detective work, and used it to examine surfaces for marks or traces that might prove significant. He looked for fingerprints, though the science of fingerprint identification was still in its infancy and not yet accepted as reliable evidence in court. He examined footprints in the dirt floor of the older sections of the cottage, finding multiple overlapping impressions that would be impossible to distinguish now that so many people had tramped through. He searched for foreign objects, for anything that might have been dropped or left behind by the killer. He found nothing conclusive. The cottage yielded its secrets reluctantly, if at all. The investigation expanded to include inquiries about the Marshall family's finances and relationships. Had Emmanuel owed money to anyone? Had he been involved in disputes with customers over work performed? Had there been romantic entanglements, jealousies, rivalries? The answers that emerged painted a picture of an ordinary family with ordinary problems, but nothing that rose to the level that might motivate such extreme violence. Marshall had debts, but they were small and typical, amounts owed to the grocer and coal merchant, debts that were expected to be settled eventually, and that caused no particular concern. His work had satisfied his customers. There were no complaints, no angry confrontations over poor workmanship or unfulfilled contracts. His marriage appeared stable by the standards of the time. There were no rumours of affairs or domestic violence that would suggest a motive rooted in personal relationships. The investigators began to consider the possibility that the motive might not be personal at all, that this might have been a robbery that escalated into murder. But that theory struggled against the facts. Nothing of value had been taken. The small amount of money in the cottage remained untouched. Marshall's tools, which represented significant value and could have been sold easily, were all present. If robbery had been the motive, the robber had acted in a manner completely contrary to the usual patterns of such crimes. Thieves took property. They did not typically murder entire families and then leave empty-handed, unless perhaps they had been interrupted before they could complete the robbery. But by whom? And why had no witness come forward? As the investigation proceeded, the people of Denham watched and waited, hungry for information, desperate for reassurance that the killer would be caught and that their community would be safe again. But the investigators could offer neither quick answers nor easy comfort. Murder investigations in the Victorian era were painstaking affairs, conducted without the forensic tools that later generations would take for granted, relying instead on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the detective's ability to piece together a coherent narrative from fragmentary facts. Tanner and Witcher worked long days interviewing dozens of people, reviewing their notes each evening, comparing theories and testing them against the evidence. They sent requests to neighbouring jurisdictions asking about known criminals who might have been in the area. They reviewed records of previous crimes to see if similar cases might suggest a pattern or a particular perpetrator. The newspapers had begun publishing accounts of the Denham murders, and the story had captured public attention in the way that certain crimes do, combining as it did elements that Victorian readers found both horrifying and fascinating. An entire family murdered, small children killed in their beds, a quiet village transformed into a scene of Gothic horror. The accounts varied in their accuracy, some based on genuine reporting and others on rumour and speculation, but all contributed to the sense that something terrible had occurred, that evil had manifested in a place where it was not supposed to exist. The publicity brought additional pressure on the investigators to solve the case quickly, but it also brought problems. People began to come forward claiming to have information, and each claim had to be investigated even when it seemed implausible or was clearly motivated by desire for attention rather than genuine knowledge. Days turned into weeks. The initial energy of the investigation began to encounter the frustration that comes when obvious leads have been exhausted and the path forward becomes unclear. The Marshall family was buried in the churchyard at St. Mary's, their graves marked with simple stones purchased through a subscription raised by sympathetic neighbours. The funeral had drawn hundreds of people, far more than the church could hold, people standing outside in the cold to pay their respects to victims they had never known, but whose deaths had touched something deep in the collective consciousness. The vicar had spoken of innocence destroyed and evil unpunished, of faith tested and community wounded. And then the mourners had dispersed, returning to their lives, and Denham had begun the slow process of trying to return to normal, even as the investigators continued their work. Chapter 5. The Question of Entry. The problem of entry haunted the investigation from its earliest hours. How had the killer entered the Marshall cottage? The question seemed simple, but its answer eluded every attempt at reconstruction. Inspector Tanner returned to the cottage repeatedly, examining the door and windows with increasing frustration, searching for some detail that had been overlooked, some explanation that would make sense of what appeared to be an impossibility. A family had been murdered in their home, yet the home showed no signs of forced entry. The door had been found closed but unlocked, suggesting either that the family habitually left it unlocked, a common enough practice in rural areas where crime was rare and neighbours were trusted, or that the killer had locked it upon departing and someone had later unlocked it, though who and why remained unclear. The door itself was a simple affair, constructed of heavy oak planks joined together and mounted on iron hinges that Marshall himself had likely forged. The lock was a basic mechanism, the kind found on thousands of cottage doors throughout England, operated by a large iron key that turned a bolt. Tanner examined the lock closely, looking for scratches or marks that might indicate it had been picked, but the metal was old and worn, marked by years of use, and any fresh scratches would have been difficult to distinguish from the existing damage. More importantly, lock-picking required skill and tools, and while such skills existed among the criminal class, they were primarily employed by urban thieves who targeted wealthy homes, not by murderers who attacked working-class families in rural villages. The windows presented an even clearer picture. There were 4 of them in the cottage, small openings set high in the walls, each covered by wooden shutters that could be secured from the inside by simple latches. All 4 windows had been found with their shutters closed and latched, making entry through them effectively impossible without breaking glass or forcing shutters, and no such damage existed. The glass in each window was intact, its surface undisturbed. The shutters showed no signs of having been pried open from outside. The latches were simple wooden bars that dropped into brackets, and these showed no damage or unusual wear. Everything suggested that the windows had been secured from inside and had remained so throughout the night of the murders and the days following. This left several possibilities, none of them entirely satisfactory. The first was that the killer had been admitted to the cottage by someone inside. He had knocked on the door and had been allowed to enter. This suggested someone known to the family, someone they had no reason to fear, someone whose presence would not have alarmed them even at a late hour. Emmanuel Marshall might have opened the door to a neighbour who claimed to need urgent assistance, or to a customer who had work that required immediate attention, or to someone claiming official business. But if the killer had been admitted voluntarily, why had there been no signs of struggle? Why had Mary Ann and the children remained in their beds while a stranger or casual acquaintance moved about the cottage? And if the killer had been a friend or close associate, someone so trusted that his presence caused no alarm, why had no one in the village been able to identify a likely suspect? The second possibility was that the door had been left unlocked and the killer had simply entered without permission, moving through the cottage so quietly that the family had not heard him until it was too late. This required imagining a killer of extraordinary stealth and boldness, someone willing to enter an occupied home not knowing what resistance he might encounter, confident in his ability to overcome a strong man like Emmanuel Marshall, along with his wife and children, before any of them could raise an alarm. It was not impossible. The element of surprise was powerful, and if the family had been sleeping or preparing for sleep, if the light had been dim and the killer had moved quickly, he might have struck his first victim before anyone realized danger was present. But this scenario still struggled to explain why no one had fought back, why no defensive wounds were found, why the children had not attempted to flee. The third possibility, darker and more troubling, was that the killer had been in the cottage already, that he was not an intruder at all, but someone who belonged there, someone whose presence was so unremarkable that no one thought to lock doors or shutter windows against him. This possibility pointed towards someone living in the cottage, someone who had been part of the household. But the only people who lived there were Emmanuel, Mary Ann, and their 3 children, and all 5 were dead. Unless there had been another person present, a lodger or servant or relative who had not been accounted for, someone who had killed the family and then departed, leaving no trace of his existence behind. Tanner investigated this possibility, questioning neighbours about whether the Marshalls had employed servants or taken in lodgers, but found no evidence to support such a theory. The cottage was small, too small to house anyone beyond the immediate family comfortably, and the Marshalls' financial situation did not allow for employing servants. Detective Sergeant Witcher, approaching the question from a different angle, considered whether the killer might have had a key to the cottage. If Marshall had given a key to someone, a trusted friend or business associate, that person could have entered at any time without forcing the door. But who would Marshall have trusted with such access, and why would he have given anyone a key in the first place? Working men did not typically distribute keys to their homes freely. The cottage was not a business premises where multiple people needed access. It was a family-dwelling, private space, and the key would have been kept by the family or hidden nearby for emergencies. Witcher interviewed people who had known Marshall well, asking about close friendships, about business partnerships, about anyone who might have been given such trust. The answers yielded no clear suspect. The investigation also had to consider the possibility of multiple killers working together. If 2 or 3 men had approached the cottage, they would have been better able to overpower its occupants to prevent escape or resistance. But multiple killers raised new questions. What would motivate several people to conspire in the murder of a blacksmith family? Criminal gangs existed in London and the industrial cities, organised groups who engaged in robbery and violence, but they did not typically operate in rural Buckinghamshire, and their targets were usually chosen for the wealth they contained. The Marshall cottage offered nothing worth the risk of such a crime, and if multiple killers had been involved, one of them might have spoken about it, might have boasted or confessed or been overheard, and such information would likely have reached the investigators by now. The question of entry became increasingly important as the investigation proceeded because it constrained the field of possible suspects. If the killer had been admitted voluntarily, he must have been someone the family knew and trusted. If he had possessed a key, he must have been someone to whom Marshall had given such access. If he had entered through stealth alone, he must have been someone familiar with the cottage layout, someone who knew where people slept and how to move through the space without alerting its occupants. Each scenario narrowed the possibilities but also raised new complications that the existing evidence could not resolve. Tanner ordered a search of the area surrounding the cottage, looking for any sign that the killer might have left behind evidence of his approach or departure. Constables walked the fields and lanes, examining the ground for footprints, searching hedgerows for discarded weapons or clothing, questioning people who lived along the possible routes the killer might have taken. The canal passed within half a mile of the cottage, and it was possible that someone could have arrived or departed by boat, travelling slantingly on the dark water and leaving no trace on the roads. The railway station was similarly close, offering another means of approach and escape. But searches of these areas yielded nothing conclusive. Too much time had passed. Too many people had walked the paths and roads in the interim. Any evidence that might have existed had been trampled or washed away by rain, or simply lost in the ordinary traffic of village life. The investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline of the evening of March 7th with greater precision. They interviewed people who had been in the vicinity of the Marshall cottage that evening, asking about lights they might have seen, sounds they might have heard, anything unusual or noteworthy. The responses were frustratingly vague. It had been a cold evening, and most people had been indoors by their fires. Those who had been outside had been focused on their own business, moving quickly from one place to another, not observing their surroundings with the careful attention that the investigators now wished they had employed. Someone thought they might have seen candlelight in the cottage windows around 8 o'clock. Someone else recalled hearing a dog barking sometime after dark, though whether that was significant or simply the ordinary sound of a village night, no one could say. The lack of blood evidence outside the sleeping areas troubled both investigators. If the killer had attacked Emmanuel Marshall first, as seemed likely given that the man would have been the greatest physical threat, there should have been blood spatter in the main room where Marshall's body had been found. Yet the walls and floor showed minimal staining, suggesting either that Marshall had been attacked while lying down, or that he had been struck in such a way that bleeding was largely internal. The doctor confirmed that skull fractures could produce extensive internal hemorrhaging, while showing relatively little external blood, particularly if the victim died quickly and the heart stopped pumping. But this precision, this ability to kill efficiently and cleanly, suggested either great luck or considerable experience with violence. Witcher considered whether the crime might have been committed by someone with military experience, someone trained in violence, someone accustomed to killing. Britain's army had recently been engaged in various colonial campaigns, and veterans of such conflicts could be found throughout the country, some successfully reintegrated into civilian life and others struggling with wounds both physical and psychological. But inquiries into whether any such veterans lived in or near Denham produced no promising leads. The few former soldiers in the area had solid alibis for the evening in question, and none had any known connection to the Marshall family. The question of motive became increasingly entangled with the question of entry. The two puzzles seemed to reinforce each other, each making the other more difficult to solve. If the killer had been admitted voluntarily, what business or relationship had provided the excuse for his late-night visit? If he had possessed a key, what trust had Marshall extended that had been so catastrophically betrayed? If he had entered through stealth, what knowledge had guided him through the cottage? And what passion had driven him to such careful, methodical violence? The investigators circled these questions repeatedly, approaching them from different angles, testing theories against the available evidence, but always coming back to the fundamental mystery. Someone had entered that cottage, had killed 5 people, and had departed without leaving clear traces of how he had accomplished any of it. As March gave way to April and the investigation entered its second month, the question of entry remained unresolved. Tanner and Witcher had developed several working theories, but none of them fit the evidence perfectly, and neither investigator felt confident enough in any single theory to base an arrest upon it. They knew that when the case eventually came to trial, if it ever did, the prosecution would need to present a coherent narrative of events, and that narrative would need to explain how the killer had gained access to the cottage. A jury would want to understand the mechanics of the crime, not just who had committed it, but how he'd managed to do so. And until the investigators could answer that question satisfactorily, until they could explain that closed door and those latched shutters and that absence of forced entry, the case would remain frustratingly incomplete. Chapter 6. Suspects and Shadows. Every murder investigation eventually reaches the point where attention must focus on specific individuals, where the broad sweep of the inquiry narrows to particular persons whose circumstances or relationships or behaviours mark them as worthy of special scrutiny. In the case of the Denham murders, this narrowing occurred gradually through the month of March and into April as investigators eliminated possibilities and identified those who remained. The process was complicated by the very ordinariness of the Marshall family, by their lack of enemies or conflicts that would provide obvious motives, by the absence of clear evidence pointing toward any single individual. Yet certain names began to appear repeatedly in the investigators' notes. Certain people emerged as figures whose connection to the family or whose behaviour warranted closer examination. The first category of suspects consisted of those who had regular access to the Marshall cottage, who came and went as part of their normal routines, whose presence would not have aroused suspicion or alarm. These were primarily customers of the blacksmith's trade, farmers and labourers who brought work to Marshall, who waited while he shaped iron to their needs, who paid him in coins counted out from worn purses. Tanner compiled a list of everyone who had done business with Marshall in the weeks preceding the murders, interviewing each person, asking about their interactions with the family, establishing their whereabouts on the evening of March 7th. Most provided alibis that could be verified through family members or neighbours. None displayed behaviour that suggested guilt or evasion. They were simply working men who had needed a blacksmith's services and who were as shocked by the murders as anyone else in the village. A second category consisted of labourers who had worked for Marshall at various times, men hired to help with heavy jobs or to assist during particularly busy periods. The relationship between a skilled craftsman and his casual labour could be fraught, marked by the tension between those who possessed knowledge and those who possessed only strength, between those who earned regular income and those who scrambled for whatever work they could find. Resentments could develop, grievances could fester, and it was not impossible that someone who had worked for Marshall might have felt cheated or disrespected in ways that fed darker impulses. Witcher investigated several such men, tracking down those who had worked at the forge in recent months, questioning them about their relationships with Marshall, searching for hints of anger or motive. One name that appeared in this context was Thomas Wheeler, a labourer of uncertain employment who had worked for Marshall sporadically over the previous year. Wheeler was known in Denham as a heavy drinker, a man who spent his wages at the Swan as quickly as he earned them, who was frequently in debt and occasionally in trouble with local authorities for drunken behaviour. Neighbours described him as volatile, quick to anger when drinking, prone to complaints about the unfairness of his lot in life. He had been heard speaking ill of Marshall on at least one occasion, claiming that the blacksmith had not paid him fairly for work performed. This made him a person of interest, someone whose history and temperament suggested potential for violence. Witcher interviewed Wheeler at length, pressing him about his whereabouts on March 7th. Wheeler's initial response was evasive, his memory conveniently vague about where he had been and what he had been doing that evening. He claimed he had been at the Swan, drinking with companions, but when investigators spoke to the publican and other patrons, their recollections did not entirely align with Wheeler's account. Some remembered seeing him early in the evening, but not later. Others could not remember seeing him at all that night. The inconsistencies were troubling, but they were not proof of guilt. Memories were unreliable, particularly memories of routine evenings in a public house where the same people gathered night after night, and where one evening blurred into another. Wheeler's cottage was searched with his reluctant permission, investigators looking for any evidence that might connect him to the murders. They found nothing incriminating. No weapon that could have been the murder weapon, no blood-stained clothing, no items taken from the Marshall cottage. Wheeler lived in poverty, his few possessions scattered about a single room that smelled of damp and sour ale. He possessed no key to the Marshall cottage, or at least none could be found. His hands showed no fresh wounds or marks that might have resulted from a struggle. When pressed about his grievance against Marshall, Wheeler admitted to feeling cheated, but claimed his anger had been the momentary frustration of a drinking man. Nothing more, certainly not sufficient to motivate murder. He became increasingly hostile as the interview proceeded, demanding to know if he was being accused, insisting on his innocence, threatening to complain to the magistrate about harassment. In the end, the investigators had to release Wheeler for lack of evidence. They could not place him at the Marshall cottage on the night in question. They could not establish a motive strong enough to justify such extreme violence. They could not connect him to the crime through any physical evidence. He remained a person of interest, someone to be watched and questioned again if new information emerged, but he could not be arrested based on what was known. This outcome frustrated both Tanner and Witcher, who felt in their instincts that Wheeler's evasiveness and volatility marked him as suspicious. But instinct was not evidence, and thus law required more than suspicion before a man could be charged with murder. A third category of suspects consisted of strangers, outsiders who might have passed through Denham around the time of the murders, who might have seen opportunity in the isolated cottage and acted on criminal impulse. The canal and railway made Denham accessible to travellers from London and beyond, and it was not impossible that someone had arrived with robbery in mind, had entered the Marshall cottage expecting to find valuables, and had murdered the family when the robbery went wrong. This theory had the advantage of explaining why no one in the village had behaved suspiciously, why no local resident had emerged as an obvious suspect. The killer might have been a stranger, someone who had departed immediately after the crime, and who was now far away, beyond the reach of Buckinghamshire's constables. But this theory struggled against the facts as much as any other. The lack of forced entry suggested either that the killer had been admitted by the family, or that he had possessed exceptional skill at entering locked buildings silently, skills that were rare even among professional criminals. The fact that nothing had been stolen argued against robbery as a motive. The methodical nature of the killings, the way each victim had been dispatched efficiently, suggested planning rather than panic, someone who knew what he intended to do rather than someone who had acted impulsively when surprised. Still, the investigators could not entirely dismiss the possibility of a stranger's involvement, and they sent inquiries to police in London and surrounding counties, asking about known criminals who might have been travelling in the area, about similar crimes that might suggest a pattern or a particular perpetrator. Among the responses they received was information about a man named James Mullins, who had been arrested in London several weeks after the Denham murders on charges of assault and robbery. Mullins had a lengthy criminal record, including convictions for housebreaking and violent assault. When questioned, he denied any involvement in the Denham case, but his denials were worth little coming from a man who made his living through crime and deception. The problem was establishing any connection between Mullins and Denham. There was no evidence that he had been in Buckinghamshire in early March. No one in Denham recognised his description, and his usual methods, according to records of his previous crimes, involved forced entry and quick theft, not the careful, though more quiet work that characterised the Marshall murders. The investigators noted Mullins as a possibility, but could not justify pursuing him as a primary suspect. As the investigation ground forward through April, other names surfaced and were investigated and ultimately dismissed. A travelling salesman who'd been in Denham in early March was questioned, but proved to have been miles away on the night of the murders. A distant relative of Mary Ann Marshall was investigated after someone suggested he might have expected to inherit something from the family, but this proved to be pure speculation with no basis in fact. A man who had argued with Emmanuel Marshall over payment for coal delivered to the forge was questioned, but his argument had been resolved weeks before the murders, and he had no apparent motive for such extreme violence. The investigation began to take on a circular quality, returning again and again to the same small pool of suspects without finding sufficient evidence to charge any of them. The public's patience was wearing thin. Newspaper articles criticised the investigators for their lack of progress, suggesting incompetence or laziness, demanding that someone be arrested and brought to justice. The pressure affected both Tanner and Witcher, who felt the weight of expectation and the frustration of a case that refused to yield its secrets. They were experienced investigators, but experience could not manufacture evidence where none existed, could not produce witnesses who had not come forward, could not resolve contradictions in the physical facts of the crime scene. In early May, more than 2 months after the murders, the investigation received what appeared to be a significant lead. A woman living in a village several miles from Denham came forward claiming that her husband had come home on the night of March 7th with blood on his clothes and had behaved strangely in the days following. The husband was a labourer named Robert Stokes, a man of poor reputation who drank heavily and who was known to have a violent temper. Senna travelled immediately to interview the woman, taking her statement in as detail, listening as she described her husband's behaviour and her growing suspicion that he might have been involved in something terrible. But when Stokes himself was questioned, a different picture emerged. The blood on his clothes had come from a pig he had helped slaughter that evening, an event witnessed by several people and easily verified. His strange behaviour had been the result of drinking, nothing more. His wife, it became clear, had reasons of her own for wanting her husband in trouble with the law, marital grievances that had nothing to do with the Denham murders, but that had motivated her to make accusations she hoped would see him arrested. The lead dissolved into nothing, another dead end in an investigation full of them. By the late spring of 1870, the case had reached a state of frustration that bordered on despair. The initial energy of the investigation had dissipated. The trail, such as it had ever existed, had gone cold. Witnesses had been interviewed and re-interviewed until there was nothing left to ask them. Physical evidence had been examined and re-examined until every possible interpretation had been exhausted. Theories had been developed and tested, and ultimately found wanting. The Marshall family remained unavenged, their killer unknown, and the village of Denham remained haunted by the knowledge that someone among them, or someone who had passed through their midst, had committed an atrocity and escaped justice. The investigators had not given up, not formally, but the active pursuit of the case had slowed to a near standstill, maintained only by the hope that someone might yet come forward with information that would break the case open, that some piece of evidence might emerge that had been overlooked, that time might eventually produce what investigation had not. Chapter 7. The Inquest. The formal inquest into the deaths of Emmanuel, Mary Ann, and the 3 Marshall children was convened in late March at the village hall in Denham, a modest building that served the community for meetings and gatherings, and which now hosted proceedings that would determine the official cause of death and potentially identify those responsible. The coroner presiding over the inquest was a man named Frederick Danby, a solicitor from Uxbridge who had served in this capacity for Buckinghamshire for more than a decade. Danby had overseen inquests into accidental deaths and suicides, into deaths from natural causes that required legal documentation, but rarely into deaths that were so clearly the result of criminal violence. His role was to guide a jury of local men through the evidence to ensure that proper procedures were followed, and to arrive at a verdict that reflected the facts as they could be determined. The jury was composed of 12 men drawn from Denham and the immediate surrounding area, property owners and substantial citizens whose judgment was considered sound and whose presence on the jury would lend authority to whatever verdict was reached. They were shopkeepers and farmers, men who had known the Marshall family at least by sight, who had been part of the community that was now seeking answers about what had happened. The selection of the jury had been careful, with potential jurors questioned about their relationship to the victims and their ability to evaluate evidence impartially. Those with close personal connections to the Marshall family had been excused. Those who had already formed strong opinions about who might be responsible were similarly dismissed. What remained was a group of men who could claim some degree of objectivity, though true objectivity in such a small community was perhaps impossible. The inquest opened on a grey morning with rain threatening, the weather matching the sombre mood of the proceedings. The village hall filled with spectators, people who had come to hear the evidence presented, to learn details that had been whispered about but not officially confirmed, to witness this formal accounting of tragedy. The coroner called the session to order, explaining to the jury their duties and responsibilities, reminding them that their task was to determine how the deceased had come to their deaths and, if possible, to identify those responsible. He cautioned them against allowing emotion to cloud their judgment, urging them instead to focus on the evidence and to reach conclusions based on facts rather than speculation or rumour. The first witness called was the neighbour who had discovered the bodies. He took his place before the coroner and jury with visible reluctance, uncomfortable with the attention, uncomfortable with the memory of what he had seen. Danby guided him through his testimony with careful questions, establishing the timeline of discovery, the reasons he had finally decided to investigate the Marshall cottage after days of silence, the scene that had confronted him when he opened that door. The witness described the dim interior, the stillness, the terrible realization that something was wrong. He described backing away from the threshold, calling for help, the crowd that had gathered. His testimony was brief but powerful, setting the scene for all that would follow. The village constable was called next, describing his arrival at the cottage, his initial examination of the scene, the steps he had taken to preserve evidence and summon more experienced investigators. His testimony established the official chain of events, the transition from a discovery made by a private citizen to an investigation conducted by legal authorities. He described the condition of the door and windows, the lack of forced entry, the arrangement of bodies in the various rooms. He spoke carefully, reading from notes he had made at the time, aware that his testimony would become part of the permanent record and might be scrutinised in any future trial. Dr. Strickland was then called to provide medical testimony. The clinical details of death that were necessary for the jury to understand what had happened. He described each victim in turn, beginning with Emmanuel Marshall, detailing the wounds found on the body, the nature of the trauma, his professional opinion about what had caused death. He spoke of fractured skulls and internal bleeding, of blows delivered with considerable force, of a weapon that was heavy and blunt. He moved through his examination of Mary Ann and each of the children with similar precision, noting the similarities in the wounds, the pattern that suggested a single perpetrator using a consistent method. His testimony was dry and factual, but its content was horrifying, the medical terminology barely masking the brutal reality of what had been done to this family. The doctor was questioned at length about his estimate of when death had occurred. He explained the difficulties of determining precise timing, the way cold weather affected the usual markers of post-mortem change, the range of days during which the murders most likely had taken place. He testified that, based on his examination, death had probably occurred between March 7th and March 9th, with March 7th or 8th being most likely. This testimony was crucial because it established the window during which the killer must have acted, the period that investigators needed to account for when examining alibis and reconstructing movements. Inspector Tanner provided testimony about the investigation, describing the methods employed, the witnesses interviewed, the physical evidence examined. He detailed the search of the cottage and surrounding area, the attempts to determine how the killer had gained entry, the various theories that had been considered and tested. His testimony painted a picture of thorough professional work, of investigators doing everything possible to solve the case, but also of an investigation that had not yet produced the results that everyone hoped for. He acknowledged that no arrest had been made, that the investigation was ongoing, that more information was needed before charges could be brought against anyone. Witnesses who had known the Marshall family were called to testify about their character and circumstances. Neighbours spoke of them as quiet, respectable people who had kept to themselves and caused no trouble. Customers of the blacksmith's trade testified that Marshall had been competent and fair in his dealings, that they had no complaints about his work or his character. The vicar of St. Mary's provided testimony about the family's attendance at church, their participation in the religious life of the community. All of this testimony served to establish that the victims had been ordinary people living ordinary lives, that there was nothing in their circumstances that obviously explained why anyone would have wanted them dead. The question of motive was addressed through testimony about the Marshall family's financial situation. Records were presented showing their modest income, their small debts, the absence of significant property or savings. The lack of any financial motive for murder became clear through this testimony. There was no inheritance to gain, no insurance policy to collect, no business interest that would benefit from the family's elimination. If money had motivated the crime, the killer had chosen his target poorly, for the Marshalls possessed nothing worth the risk of such violence. Thomas Wheeler was called to testify, much to his evident displeasure. He answered questions about his work for Marshall, about his claim that he had been cheated, about his whereabouts on the evening of March 7th. His testimony was evasive and sometimes contradictory, his memory conveniently failing on crucial points. The jury observed him closely, their expressions suggesting skepticism about his truthfulness. But skepticism was not evidence, and Wheeler's testimony, unsatisfactory as it was, did not provide grounds for charging him with murder. When he was finally dismissed, he left the hall quickly, eager to escape the scrutiny of the assembled crowd. Other potential suspects were called, or their circumstances were described through testimony from the investigators. Each was examined and found wanting in terms of concrete evidence. The pattern became clear to the jury and spectators alike. The investigators had worked diligently, had pursued every lead, but had been unable to identify the killer with certainty. The crime remained, in the formal language that would eventually appear in the verdict, the work of a person or persons unknown. The coroner's summation to the jury reviewed the evidence that had been presented, organised it into a coherent narrative, and posed the questions that the jury needed to answer. How had the Marshall family died? The answer was clear. They had been murdered, killed by blows to the head delivered with a heavy blunt instrument. When had they died? Probably on the evening of March 7th or possibly March 8th, based on medical testimony. Who had killed them? This question could not be answered with certainty based on the evidence available. The jury retired to consider their verdict, though the outcome was not really in doubt. They deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their finding. The verdict was read aloud in the hushed hall. Emmanuel Marshall, Mary Ann Marshall, and their 3 children had been willfully murdered by person or persons unknown. It was the verdict that everyone had expected but that no one had wanted. It confirmed officially what had been known from the beginning, that a terrible crime had been committed. But it brought the community no closer to justice or closure. The victim remained unavenged, the killer remained free, and the investigation would have to continue, though with what prospects of success, no one could say. The inquest concluded, the jury was dismissed, and the crowd dispersed into the grey afternoon, carrying with them the weight of knowledge without resolution, of questions without answers. Chapter 8. A theory takes shape. Through the summer months of 1870, as Denham attempted to return to some semblance of normal life, the investigation continued in a more subdued fashion. Inspector Tanner had returned to his regular duties in Uxbridge, though he remained nominally in charge of the case and continued to review any new information that emerged. Detective Sergeant Witcher had been recalled to London to work on other matters, though he maintained correspondence with Tanner and occasionally offered suggestions based on his broader experience with criminal cases. The active phase of the investigation, with its intensive interviews and searches, had given way to a more passive approach, a waiting game in which the investigators hoped that time might produce what immediate effort had not. It was in this context, in late July, that a new piece of information came to light. A man named William Cross, who worked as a clerk at the railway station in Denham, approached the local constable with information he claimed might be relevant to the Marshall murders. Cross explained that he had not come forward earlier because he had not been certain of the significance of what he knew, and because he had feared becoming entangled in an investigation that might damage his reputation or cost him his employment. But his conscience had troubled him increasingly as the months passed, and he had finally decided that he needed to share what he knew and let the authorities determine whether it mattered. What Cross had to tell concerned a man named Joseph Burton, a casual labourer who had worked at various jobs around Denham for several years. Burton was known to Cross because he frequently took the railway to and from London, where he sometimes found work when nothing was available locally. On the morning of March 8th, the day after the murders were believed to have occurred, Cross had been on duty at the station when Burton appeared, apparently intending to take the early train to London. What had struck Cross as odd was Burton's appearance and behaviour. His clothes had appeared dishevelled and dirty, more so than would be expected even for a labourer. His hands had been wrapped in cloth as though he had injured them, and most significantly, when Cross had greeted him in passing, Burton had seemed startled and nervous, had avoided eye contact, and had boarded the train quickly without engaging in the usual pleasantries that characterised interactions between men who knew each other. This information interested Tanner considerably when it was relayed to him. Joseph Burton was a name that had appeared in the early stages of the investigation, though only in passing. He had been interviewed briefly as someone who had occasionally done work for Marshall, hauling materials or assisting with heavy tasks at the forge. But Burton had not emerged as a person of particular interest at the time. He had no known grievance against the Marshall family. His interview had been brief and unremarkable. When asked about his whereabouts on March 7th, he had claimed to have been at his lodgings in Denham, and there had been no reason to doubt him. Now, however, with Cross's testimony about Burton's appearance and behaviour on the morning of March 8th, Tanner began to reconsider whether Burton warranted closer scrutiny. The inspector began to investigate Burton's background more thoroughly. He was a man of about 30 years, unmarried, without family in the immediate area, a drifter of sorts who moved from job to job and place to place without putting down roots anywhere. He had come to Denham several years earlier from somewhere in the Midlands, though the exact details of his origins were vague and difficult to trace. He supported himself through casual labour, doing whatever work he could find, sometimes leaving the area for weeks at a time when employment opportunities dried up, then returning when he had exhausted possibilities elsewhere. This transient lifestyle made him difficult to track and difficult to know. He had no close friends in Denham, no confidants who might provide insights into his character or activities. He was simply one of many poor men who existed on the margins of rural society, noticed only when they were needed for work and forgotten when they were not. Tanner learned that Burton had lodged at a house in Denham owned by a widow named Mrs. Sarah Perkins, who took in lodgers to supplement her meagre income. The inspector visited Mrs. Perkins and questioned her about Burton's behaviour in early March. She remembered that period because Burton had given notice that he was leaving, had said he was going to London to look for better work, and had departed on March 8th or 9th. She could not remember exactly which day. She recalled that he had paid his rent, collected his few belongings, and left without much ceremony. She had not noticed anything particularly unusual about his behaviour, though she admitted that she had not paid close attention. Burton had been a quiet lodger who kept to himself, caused no trouble, and required little from her, beyond a bed and occasional meals. When asked about Burton's hands, Mrs. Perkins paused, thinking back. She believed he might have had some injury to his hands, now that she considered it. He had worn cloth wrappings on them for a day or two before he left. When she had asked about it, he had said something about an accident while working, a cut or burn that needed to heal. She had not thought much of it at the time. Such injuries were common among working men. But now, with the inspector pressing her about details, she began to wonder whether there had been something strange about Burton's manner when he explained the injury, a reluctance to discuss it, a desire to change the subject. Tanner next attempted to trace Burton's movements after he left Denham. The railway records showed that a ticket to London had been purchased on the morning of March 8th, though whether Burton had actually used that ticket, or where he had gone after arriving in London, was impossible to determine with certainty. The metropolis swallowed people easily, and a single man without family or fixed employment could disappear into its vastness without leaving traces that investigators could follow. Inquiries were sent to London police asking whether anyone matching Burton's description had been arrested or had come to official attention, but the responses were negative. If Burton was in London, he was managing to avoid notice by the authorities. the investigation into Burton's background revealed some troubling information. In the Midlands, where he had lived before coming to Denham, he had been questioned in connection with a burglary, though never charged. Witnesses in that case had described him as having a violent temper when drinking, as being capable of sudden rages that frightened those around him. These were the kinds of details that, once known, began to colour every other piece of information. Burton's casual relationship with the Marshall family, which had seemed innocent when first examined, now took on potentially darker significance. He had known the layout of the cottage from his work there. He might have known about any money or valuables the family possessed. He would have been familiar with Marshall's schedule and routines. The cloth wrappings on his hands, initially explained as covering work-related injuries, now suggested a different possibility. Could they have been covering wounds sustained during the commission of the murders? If Burton had struck Emmanuel Marshall multiple times with a heavy implement, the force of those blows might have caused injury to his own hands, particularly if he had not been wearing gloves. The vibrations of striking bone with metal could bruise or split skin on the palms and fingers. Such injuries would need to be concealed if they might raise questions. And Burton's nervous behaviour at the railway station, his apparent desire to leave Denham quickly, his avoidance of conversation with Cross, all of these details fit a pattern of guilty flight. Inspector Tanner began to construct a theory of the crime centred on Joseph Burton as the perpetrator. The theory was not based on conclusive evidence, but rather on an accumulation of suspicious circumstances that, taken together, suggested Burton's involvement. According to this theory, Burton had gone to the Marshall cottage on the evening of the March 7th, possibly seeking money or possibly motivated by some grievance that no one yet understood. He had been admitted to the cottage, either because Marshall knew him from their past work relationship or because Burton had offered some excuse for his late visit. Once inside, Burton had attacked the family, killing them methodically to prevent identification and escape. The injuries to his hands had resulted from the violence of the attack. He had then fled, spent an agitated night at his lodgings, and departed Denham the next morning on the first train to London, hoping to disappear before the bodies were discovered and an investigation began. This theory explained many of the puzzling elements of the case. It accounted for the lack of forced entry, since Burton would have been admitted by Marshall. It explained the absence of theft. If Burton had panicked and fled after committing the murders without taking anything, it provided a suspect whose background included hints of violence and criminal behaviour, and crucially, it offered a narrative that could be presented to a jury, a story that made sense of the crime even if some details remained uncertain. But the theory had significant weaknesses. There was no physical evidence directly connecting Burton to the murders. No weapon had been found that could be traced to him. No witness had seen him at or near the Marshall cottage on the night in question. The cloth wrappings on his hands and his nervous behaviour at the railway station were suspicious but not conclusive, and Burton himself could not be found to be questioned or arrested. Tanner conferred with the county prosecutor about whether the evidence against Burton was sufficient to issue a warrant for his arrest. The prosecutor was sceptical. The case was entirely circumstantial. Burton's past work at the forge proved nothing except that he had known the family. The railway clerk's testimony about his behaviour was interesting, but hardly conclusive proof of guilt. The injuries to his hands could easily have been the work-related accidents he claimed, and his departure from Denham could be explained by his stated intention to seek better employment in London. A skilled defence attorney would demolish such weak evidence in court, the prosecutor warned. Unless stronger evidence could be developed, unless witnesses could be found who had seen Burton at the cottage that night, unless some physical evidence could connect him to the crime, prosecution would be unlikely to succeed. Nevertheless, the theory that Burton was responsible gained currency among investigators and in the community. Once a narrative existed, once a name could be attached to the horror, people found it easier to accept that explanation than to continue living with uncertainty. Burton became, in the minds of many in Denham, the likely killer, the man who had destroyed the Marshall family and escaped justice. The fact that he could not be found only reinforced the belief in his guilt. An innocent man would have remained in the area, would have cooperated with investigators, would have had nothing to hide. Burton's disappearance was taken as evidence of consciousness of guilt, a legal principle that held that fleeing from investigation suggested awareness of wrongdoing. Through the autumn of 1870, efforts continued to locate Joseph Burton. His description was circulated to police forces throughout England. Inquiries were made at workhouses and lodging houses in London and other cities, places where transient labourers might be found. Advertisements were placed in newspapers asking for information about his whereabouts, but Burton had seemingly vanished, either because he had left England entirely or because he had assumed a false identity and was living under another name. The investigation had produced a primary suspect but could not produce the suspect himself, a frustration that epitomised the entire case. Chapter 9. Justice or its Shadow. The winter of 1870 gave way to the spring of 1871, and still Joseph Burton remained unfound. The investigation had reached what appeared to be a permanent impasse. The theory of Burton's guilt had been developed as fully as the available evidence allowed, but without being able to question him or present him before a magistrate, the case could proceed no further. Inspector Tanner continued to receive occasional reports of sightings, men who resembled Burton's description spotted in various parts of the country, but each report proved to be mistaken identity or deliberate misdirection. The railway clerk's testimony about Burton's suspicious behaviour on the morning of March 8th remained the strongest evidence of his potential involvement, but testimony alone, without supporting physical evidence or additional witnesses, would not support a conviction, even if Burton could be brought to trial. In April of 1871, more than a year after the murders, a development occurred that initially seemed promising but ultimately proved to be another frustration. A man matching Burton's description was arrested in Liverpool on suspicion of theft. When the local police discovered that he was wanted for questioning in connection with a murder case in Buckinghamshire, they notified Inspector Tanner, who travelled to Liverpool immediately to interview the prisoner. But when Tanner arrived and saw the man in custody, it became clear within minutes that this was not Joseph Burton. The physical resemblance was superficial at best, the result of vague descriptions rather than actual similarity. The prisoner's history and background bore no relation to Burton's known life. It was simply another case of mistaken identity, another disappointment in a case that had produced too many of them. The failure to locate Burton forced the authorities to consider whether they had been pursuing the wrong man entirely. Perhaps Burton's suspicious behaviour had been coincidental, unrelated to the murders, the nervous manner of a man who had other reasons to avoid attention from law enforcement, or who simply possessed an anxious temperament. Perhaps his departure from Denham had been exactly what he claimed, a search for better employment opportunities in London. Perhaps the real killer was someone else entirely, someone who had never emerged as a suspect, who had committed the perfect crime and would never be identified. These possibilities troubled Inspector Tanner, who had invested considerable time and energy in pursuing Burton, and who did not want to believe that all that effort had been misdirected. In the absence of progress in finding Burton or identifying any alternative suspect, the official investigation gradually wound down. By the summer of 1871, active work on the case had essentially ceased. The file remained open, and any new information would still be investigated, but no one was actively pursuing leads or conducting interviews. The Marshall murders had become what was known in police parlance as a cold case, a crime that had been thoroughly investigated without resolution, that remained unsolved not through lack of effort, but through lack of evidence. Such cases were not uncommon in the Victorian era, when forensic science was primitive and criminal investigation relied heavily on witness testimony that often proved unreliable or unavailable. The community of Denham gradually adapted to living with the knowledge that the murderer of the Marshall family had never been caught. The cottage where the family had died stood empty for some time, for no one wished to rent or purchase a property with such dark associations. Eventually it was torn down, the material salvaged and reused elsewhere, and the land returned to other purposes. The forge was dismantled, Marshall's tools sold or distributed, the business that had sustained the family erased as thoroughly as the family itself had been. The graves in St. Mary's churchyard remained, tended by neighbours who felt that someone should remember, but even that attention gradually diminished as time passed and new tragedies displaced old ones in the community's consciousness. The question of justice, of whether Joseph Burton or anyone else would ever face legal consequences for the murders, had to be considered in the context of Victorian legal philosophy and practice. Justice in that era was understood not merely as the solving of crimes, but as the formal process of accusation, trial, and punishment conducted according to established procedures. A crime remained unjust, not because it had occurred, but because the perpetrator had not been subjected to the law's authority. The failure to bring anyone to trial for the Marshall murders represented, in this view, a failure of justice itself, a gap in the social order that could not be filled by theories or suspicions. Had Burton been captured and brought to trial, the case would have tested the limits of circumstantial evidence in securing a conviction. The prosecution would have needed to present a compelling narrative of guilt based on Burton's suspicious behaviour, his injuries, his flight from Denham, and his prior history of violence. They would have needed to convince 12 jurors that these circumstances, taken together, prove beyond reasonable doubt that Burton had murdered the Marshall family. But doubt would have been easy to introduce. The defence would have emphasised the lack of direct evidence, the absence of witnesses who had seen Burton at the cottage, the possibility of innocent explanations for every suspicious circumstance. They would have argued that suspicion was not proof, that flight from investigation might reflect fear of unjust accusation rather than consciousness of guilt, that injuries to the hands could result from any number of causes. The standard of proof in criminal cases, even in the Victorian era, required that guilt be established beyond reasonable doubt. This was a high bar, deliberately set to protect against wrongful conviction, rooted in the principle that it was better for 10 guilty men to go free than for one innocent man to be punished. In the Marshall case, even if Burton had been the killer, the evidence might not have been sufficient to meet this standard. Juries in that era were composed of property-owning men who took their responsibilities seriously, who understood that a conviction for murder would result in execution by hanging, and who were reluctant to send a man to the gallows based on circumstantial evidence alone. The prosecutor's assessment that the case against Burton was weak had been sound. Without stronger evidence, Somer's conviction would have been unlikely even if Burton had been available to stand trial. This raised uncomfortable questions about what justice meant when it could not be achieved through the legal system. Did the community of Denham have the right to consider Burton guilty based on the available evidence, even though he had never been convicted in court? Did the belief in his guilt provide any comfort to those who mourned the Marshall family? Or did the absence of a trial, the lack of formal judgment, leave a wound that could not heal, a story without proper ending? These were not merely abstract philosophical questions, but practical matters that affected how people understood their world and their place in it. The Victorian era placed great faith in institutions, in the ability of properly constituted authorities to investigate crimes and administer justice. When those institutions failed to produce results, as they had in the Marshall case, it challenged that faith in for troubling ways. There were no further arrests connected to the Marshall murders. No one else emerged as a serious suspect. The case file, growing dusty in some office in Uxbridge or London, became simply one more record of unsolved crime, one more testament to the limits of 19th century law enforcement. Inspector Tanner eventually retired from service, his career marked by many successes, but haunted by this one failure. Detective Sergeant Witcher continued his work in London, gaining fame for some cases and notoriety for others, but he never forgot the cottage in Denham and the 5 bodies found within. Both men would occasionally discuss the case in their later years, reviewing the evidence, wondering what they had missed, speculating about what had really happened that night in March 1870. The Marshall murders joined the catalogue of Victorian crimes that captured public imagination precisely because they remained unsolved. They were discussed in books about famous cases, cited as examples of the challenges facing criminal investigators, analysed by those interested in the darker aspects of English history. But beneath all the analysis and speculation, beneath the theories and the discussions of evidence, there remained the simple human tragedy of a family destroyed, of lives cut short without reason, of children who had done nothing to deserve their fate. No amount of investigation or theorizing could change that fundamental reality. Justice, whether achieved or not, could not restore what had been lost. Chapter 10. The Memory That Remains. The decades that followed the Marshall murders saw Denham change in ways both subtle and profound. The village grew slowly, as rural communities did when the railway and improved roads made them accessible to people seeking homes within reach of London but beyond its immediate sprawl. New houses were built, new families arrived, and gradually the proportion of residents who had any memory of March 1870 diminished. Children who had been young when the murders occurred grew into adults with families of their own. Those who had been adults at the time aged and eventually died, taking their memories with them. By the turn of the 20th century, only a handful of elderly residents could claim to remember the Marshall family or the investigation that had consumed the village for months. Yet the story persisted, transmitted through oral tradition and occasional written accounts, preserved in the collective memory of the community in ways that were not always accurate, but that served important functions nonetheless. The Marshall murders became Denham's ghost story, its dark legend, the tale that was told to newcomers as a way of establishing the village's history and character. The details became confused over time, the number of victims sometimes exaggerated, the circumstances of discovery embellished with dramatic flourishes that had no basis in fact. Joseph Burton's name was sometimes remembered, sometimes forgotten, sometimes replaced with other names as different theories of guilt circulated through the generations. The cottage site, cleared of its buildings, took on an almost sacred quality in local memory. People avoided it after dark, not from rational fear, but from that instinctive unease that attaches to places where terrible events have occurred. Children dared each other to approach the spot at dusk, proving their courage by touching the ground where the cottage had stood. Adults who walked past during the day found their steps quickening slightly, their eyes drawn to the empty space, their minds supplying images of what had happened there despite never having witnessed it themselves. This attachment of emotional significance to place was characteristic of how communities processed trauma, marking in physical space the memory of events that could not be forgotten. The graves in St Mary's churchyard received visitors long after anyone who had known the Marshall family personally had died. The stones marking the burial sites became weathered and difficult to read, the inscriptions worn by rain and wind until the names were barely legible. But the grave's location was known, passed down through local knowledge, and people continued to place flowers there on occasion, an anonymous gesture of remembrance for victims of a crime that had never been solved. These small acts of commemoration suggested that the community felt a continuing obligation to the dead, a sense that forgetting would be a second injustice added to the first. The case appeared in various published accounts of Victorian crime, usually as a footnote or brief anecdote in broader surveys of unsolved murders. These accounts varied in their accuracy and completeness, some based on careful research and contemporary records and others clearly drawing on local legend and speculation. Authors who included the Marshall murders in their books typically presented them as an example of the limitations of 19th century criminal investigation, as evidence of how difficult it was to solve crimes in an era before fingerprinting, before systematic forensic analysis, before the technologies that would revolutionize police work in the 20th century. These analyses were not wrong, but they sometimes missed the human dimension of the story, reducing the Marshall family to data points in a larger argument about the history of law enforcement. Occasionally, new theories about the murders surfaced. In the 1920s, a local historian claimed to have discovered evidence that Joseph Burton had died in a workhouse in Manchester in 1875, living under an assumed name, and that a deathbed confession had been recorded in which he admitted to committing murders in Buckinghamshire. But when other researchers attempted to verify this claim, they found no supporting documentation. The workhouse records from that period were incomplete, and no confession matching the description could be located. The theory joined the many other unverifiable claims that surrounded the case, adding to confusion rather than clarity. In the 1950s, interest in the case revived when a true crime writer researched the murders for a book about unsolved Victorian cases. The writer travelled to Denham, interviewed elderly residents, searched through archives and eventually produced a chapter that presented the known facts along with speculation about what might have happened. This account reached a wider audience than previous mentions of the case had achieved, and for a time letters arrived at Denham's parish office from people around England who claimed to have information about the murders or about Joseph Burton's fate. Most of these letters contained nothing useful, being based on confused memories or deliberate fabrications. A few provided details that seemed potentially significant but could not be verified at such a distance from the events in question. The question of whether Joseph Burton had actually been guilty became impossible to answer with certainty as the years passed. The evidence that had made him a suspect, the railway clerk's testimony about his suspicious behaviour and the injuries to his hands remained the same, but interpretation of that evidence shifted with changing understanding of criminal behaviour and investigation. Modern analysis of the case conducted by researchers interested in historical crime tended to be more sceptical of Burton's guilt than contemporary investigators had been. The lack of physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene, the absence of any witness who had seen him at the cottage, the relatively weak motive that could be established, all suggested that Burton might have been no more than a convenient suspect, someone whose marginal social position and transient lifestyle made him easy to blame. Alternative theories emerged over the decades, some more plausible than others. One persistent theory held that the murders had been committed by someone within the extended family, someone who had been overlooked during the investigation and because family members were not considered suspects initially. But research into the Marshall family tree and the movements of relatives in March 1870 produced no evidence to support this theory. Another theory suggested that the crime had been committed by a mentally disturbed individual acting without rational motive, someone who had killed the family in the grip of madness, and who might never have been connected to his victims in any meaningful way. This theory was impossible to prove or disprove, but had the virtue of explaining why no clear motive had ever been established. The truth was that the Marshall murders would never be solved in any definitive sense. Too much time had passed, too many witnesses had died, too many records had been lost or were never created in the first place. The case had reached that state of historical ambiguity where certainty was impossible and speculation was all that remained. Future researchers might uncover documents that had been overlooked, might find new evidence in archives that had not previously been searched, but the likelihood of discovering information that would conclusively identify the killer seemed remote. The case would remain forever open, forever unresolved, a mystery preserved in the historical record. What could be said with certainty was that 5 people had died violently in March of 1870, that their deaths had been a tragedy for their community and a failure of the justice system that was supposed to protect them. The Marshall family had been ordinary people living ordinary lives until the moment when violence entered their home and destroyed them. They had done nothing to earn their fate. They had simply been vulnerable, and someone had exploited that vulnerability for reasons that would never be fully understood. Their deaths had caused fear and sorrow in Denham, had challenged the community's sense of safety and order, and had left scars that took generations to heal fully. The memory of the Marshall murders persisted not because the case was particularly mysterious or because the investigation had been especially dramatic, but because the crime touched something fundamental about human existence and community. It demonstrated that safety was conditional, that evil could appear anywhere, that the structures of law and order that people depended on were imperfect and could fail. These were uncomfortable truths that every generation had to learn, and the Marshall case provided Denham with a concrete example of those truths, a story that could be told and retold as a reminder of vulnerability and loss. As the 21st century arrived and Denham continued to evolve, becoming increasingly connected to London's suburban sprawl. Fewer and fewer residents knew anything about the Marshall murders. The story had faded from active memory, preserved only in historical records and occasional mentions in books about Victorian crime. The cottage site had long since been built over, new structures occupying the ground where the Marshall family had lived and died. The graves in St Mary's churchyard were now difficult to find. Their stones nearly illegible, visited only by occasional researchers or history enthusiasts who had some reason to seek them out. Yet in some way the murders remained part of Denham's identity, a piece of its past that could not be entirely erased, even when it was no longer actively remembered. The village had been marked by what happened in March 1870, shaped by the investigation that followed, changed by the knowledge that innocence could be destroyed and justice could fail. Those effects had diminished with time but had never entirely disappeared. They existed in the accumulated layers of local history, in the stories that had been passed down through generations, in the way that the community understood itself and its relationship to the dark aspects of human nature. The candle burned low, the chamber fell upon, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark. Emmanuel Marshall and his family passed from memory into the deeper past, becoming names on weathered stones, entries in dusty ledgers, subjects of occasional scholarly interest but no longer living presences in anyone's consciousness. Their story ended not with resolution or understanding, but with the gradual fading that claims all things, the slow erasure that time works on even the most terrible events. They had lived. They had died. They had been mourned, and eventually, inevitably, they had been forgotten by all but those who make it their business to remember the forgotten, who search through archives and records preserving stories that might otherwise vanish entirely. In that preservation, incomplete and imperfect as it was, the Marshall family found their small measure of immortality, their assurance that they had existed and that their deaths had mattered, even if justice had never been achieved and their killer had never been named.